Okay, thank you for coming to this restoration case study of Picnic at Hanging Rock. I'd like to thank Elena for inviting me and to represent my colleagues as part of this, both the school and the festival, and also to Gianluca Farinelli for selecting the film for this year's edition. It's, as always, a privilege and a pleasure to be in Bologna at the end of June. I'm going to keep this mercifully short for a number of reasons, not least the fact that this is a really awkward day to lose my voice, and there's some slight change in the format. I'm going to give an overview of the experience of actually producing this restoration, and Peter Richards, who runs the facility in Canberra, Australia, who was involved not only with dealing with the National Film and Sound Archive about scanning the original camera negative at our facility, but he was also directly involved with Peter Weir, specifically when it came to the grade, a HDR grade, which of course had its challenges during lockdown, and I'm sure Peter can tell you more about that. And if you have any technical questions, Peter's there to answer those. So I think really what I want to draw attention to is 2 points, and that is the changing needs of commercial distributors, particularly those involved with physical media, specifically the consumer need for HDR. And the other point is about the business of involving both the cinematographer and director in grading, particularly HDR grades. It was a few days ago, as I'm sure many of you did, I sat in on the HDR of Classic Films panel, and it's invaluable to listen to the experiences and insights of friends and colleagues involved and how they address this difficult issue, as it's relatively new technology, and the path forward isn't always clear. So if that presented a wide-angle view of this topic, I would like to think that what we'll be talking about in the next 20 minutes is a close-up looking at a specific instance. I want to make it very clear that my entry into this world is primarily through film history and programming. I am not a technician, and that's why Peter is available to take your questions on this subject. I am essentially the curator of this project, which means I said, let's restore Picnic at Hanging Rock, which is a very short 7 words, but it has major repercussions for Peter Richards, who's dealing with the National Film and Sound Archive, Gosia Grzyb, the colorist, and Wojtek Janio, the restoration supervisor, who have worked pro bono for 3 years to get this title, which we all feel incredibly strongly about, restored in 4K in HDR. So really, that's the kind of entry point, and I think the first question, the first subject I'd like to discuss is why Picnic at Hanging Rock now? And I would say 2 reasons. One's cultural and the other's practical. Picnic at Hanging Rock is usually presented as the film of the Australian New Wave. And I think, given the changes of the last 5-6 years in culture, politics in general, I think it's a good time to look at the film again, particularly from the perspective of colonialism. It is a film about colonialism, albeit in a bleak one. It's also a film about nature and the environment. It's very interesting in terms of genre. Is it a period drama? Is it a crime film? You don't see the crime. Is it a horror film? I've seen a lot of people describe it as a horror film or a folk horror film. You don't see any blood and gore. So I would say it's a terror film in the way that you experience dread. It's also very interesting in terms of its relationship to a whole generation of women directors: Carol Morley, Sofia Coppola, Lucille Hadžihalivovich, if I can pronounce that correctly. And also, I think how it presents women is interesting given the cultural changes that are taking place at the moment. The practical reasons, which I'm sure you're interested in, is the previous master was a HD source dating back over 10 years. It was sourced from an interpositive, and it was 16:9 enhanced, which was the fashion about 20 years ago, as you know, but it's a sort of bastard ratio between 166 and 185. And it seemed a good reason to go back to the original camera negative, present it in its original aspect ratio. And more importantly, Peter Weir expressed his dissatisfaction with the previous grade. And given the fact that we were working with the original camera negative, and we had access to reference prints, it was a good opportunity to address that. And I'd like at this point to play the clip. It's not a restoration demo, it's a comparison between the previous master, which is the source which was released in the UK. I think it's the same, it is the same release which Criterion released, and then the new master as well, so you can see the differences. Thank you.
Look! Not down at the ground, Edith. Way up there in the sky.
First thing is, I received this comparison from Wojtek this morning with the note. The difference between the two masters is considerable. Some might even call it revisionist, good luck, smiley face. So the first thing I'd like to say is about the previous master. I was at a restoration conference or meeting in Warsaw about 2-3 years ago, and Kieran Webb from the BFI made a distinction between digitization, remastering, and restoration. And I think one thing which is clear about the previous master, it is very much a graded scan. As you can see, there's no stabilization, there's flicker, and there was a lot of mess which was actually on the film, which was also actually on the original camera negative. So yeah, this clearly required a lot of digital cleanup. I think one of the subjects I want to kind of focus on, it is in fact that color grade. I think one of the most noticeable differences which I want to address is first the grass and secondly the costumes. On the subject of the costumes, we had access to the original costumes and also interviews from the time. I think it is important to actually read around the evolution of the film, and they are very much not white, and I think that maybe in the previous master those were calibrated in such a way to make them look white, but they're not white in real life, and the costume designer went out the way to say that they are not white, they're off-white kind of. Practically how this came about. I work as a consultant for a UK distributor, Second Sight Films. So that means I'm dealing mainly with rights, materials, and content to license for their particular editions. They had obviously licensed the film from the rights holder, and this coincided with the time when Wojtek, who was the co-founder of Fixer Film, a post-production company based in Warsaw. He's now head of restoration at MTI, and was also set up a new business with Peter Richards in Canberra, specifically to digitize and scan films from the National Film and Sound Archive, where the original camera negative of Picnic at Hanging Rock is held. The Australian Film and Television and Radio School, so we restored Jane Campion's Peel, and also the Australian Public Television. So it was good timing, the fact that we were able to ship an ARRI scanner to Canberra just as this project was about to start. I think it is important to talk about the production history of Picnic at Hanging Rock. The film was shot and released in 1975. However, in 1998, Peter Weir released a director's cut of the film, which, interestingly, is shorter than the theatrical cut. Also, it had a different, more modern sound mix, and also digitally, telegraph poles and aerials were removed from that particular version. So it was necessary to first conform the scan negative with the director's cut, replicate the digital cleanup, and in some instances, Wojtek identified TV aerials and telegraph poles which were still visible, which Weir asked to be removed. Now, I must also make clear that we have included both versions for posterity. I mean, Weir, I must make clear, considers the director's cut definitive, his only version. But I think in the interest of film history, we have actually restored both the theatrical cut and the director's cut, the theatrical cut with the original mono, which was the sound on that clip, and Weir's more recent sound mix on the director's cut. A couple of real-world problems we encountered just as we started the project, and that was the Australian bushfires, which, of course, was not a great start to the project and presented certain logistical challenges, to put it mildly. Then COVID, and then Russell Boyd, the cinematographer who we were working on. The plan was that we would work with Russell on the grade and then present the film to Peter Weir for approval. Russell was incredibly helpful, but unfortunately he fell sick at that point. And it was Weir took over, and in the end, Russell was well enough to take part in the final stages of approval. The digital cleanup was carried out in Poland, and the grade was conducted remotely, obviously, because of COVID. The one thing I should say is that we started grading in SDR, and Russell's initial grade was quite naturalistic, but he was very deferential to Peter Weir. And then when Russell fell ill, the distributor also wanted to release in HDR, so we decided to start the grade from scratch directly with Weir. The first phone call I had with Peter Weir about the direction he wanted to go, he gave three points which mean you can see very clearly in that. The first, he said the grass should not be luscious. This is Australia. It should be dry. And secondly, the skins should be slightly pinky, if anything, almost sunburnt in some cases because of the heat. And the one thing he felt with the previous master, he felt it erred in the direction of the yellow when he wanted it to be, I quote, rosy. Again, I think it's important to read around. Reading the original book by Joan Lindsay, upon which the film is based, at the key moment in the book when the girls disappear, Lindsay writes, or she talks about drifts of rosy smoke, and in the film, Edith, one of the girls which walks away when she goes back to the scene of the crime, so to speak. She refers to seeing a red cloud. So it's not just an aesthetic issue going towards this, it is obviously connected very much with the work in question. And this is really, I think, also, it was interesting to read the archival reviews and also to talk to Boyd and Weir about how they developed the aesthetic and what they were going after. And there were two photographic references. The first is the early color photography of Jacques-Henri Lartigue, which, as you can see, is this slightly washed out kind of look. That also relates to the fact the film is set in 1900, and clearly it's an artistic decision to replicate the look of early color photography from that epoch. And photography plays a part in the film as well. The other potentially problematic reference is the photography of David Hamilton, which was another reference. I think it's difficult it needs to be made clear how Hamilton was perceived in his role in not just photography, but I would say pop culture in the 1970s. I have a friend in Paris who is the assistant to Helmut Newton, and he assures me that if you asked anyone in France, name me two famous photographers, the first would be Henri Cartier-Bresson, and the second would be David Hamilton. So this kind of pastel-y, pastoral, slightly romantic look was, it was very much of its time, very 70s, but it was also a key visual reference for the look of Picnic at Hanging Rock. A few quick comments. Hamilton famously or infamously used to breathe on the camera lenses to give it a diffuse look. When he made films, he used diffusion filters. But Boyd actually hanged fabric in the trees to diffuse the light, which I think is much more effective and considerably less kitschy, and why the film holds up to today. But that's my own personal taste and opinion. Right. Yeah, the one interesting thing about the aspect ratios, Russell thought it was 185, Weir said it was 166, and it was only until Peter Richards went to the National Film and Sound Archive to check the reference print, which had the aspect ratio listed as 166 to 1. On one level, I think, well, maybe this was a conscious attempt to have a European look. That was the decision for that aspect ratio. But I think more practically and importantly, I find it really shocking and surprising how difficult it is to sometimes determine the aspect ratio of films. I know my friend and colleague James White had a similar headache with Blood and Black Lace a few years ago. It's surprising how that's not always super clear. Picnic at Hanging Rock is shot outdoors with natural light, so on slow film stock, so it's definitely not a grainy film. But we did notice when shifting from the negative to the duplicate elements, particularly during the title sequence, and a lot of the psychedelic moments on the rock itself, it was the grain was noticeable and sort of dragging you out of this experience. So it did seem legitimate grounds to address that, but only in those sections. So in terms of the outputs of the project, so the DCP that was screened on Saturday and will be screened on the 2nd of July was obviously SDR downscaled from the HDR grade. We've also been making a 35mm film out for both preservation and also exhibition, although that unfortunately wasn't ready for this particular festival. And the materials, of course, have been archived for the National Film and Sound Archive of Australia. The festival agency will be handling both the DCP and the 35mm print. I just want to, before handing over to Peter, who I'm sure will be in a much better position to answer any of your questions, to thank not just Peter, but also Gosia Grzyb, who did the grade, and also Wojtek, Janio. As I said, they're really the real authors of this restoration. And I've had a long relationship with them when I lived in Poland. Our relationship was as such whereby I was coming from a curator's point of view, and while we didn't have huge financial resources, we did decide, wouldn't it be great to allocate workforce and time and resources to restore the films we wanted to see, which led to the restoration of Borowczyk's Story of Sen, the Borowczyk and Lenica short films, which I negotiated with the Polish Film Institute, Andrzej Żuławski's Na Srebrnym Globie, on the Silver Globe, the restoration of Franciszka and Stefan Temeson's Europa, and also the Parajanov short films in Armenia, Georgia, Ukraine, the outtakes from The Color of Pomegranates, and Maria Sakian's Mayak. And more recently, Dr. Caligari by Steven Sadian and Café Flash, which is our current project. So an eclectic choice of films there. We used to joke, let's do a film foundation for freaks. So thank you very much. I will now pass you over to Peter Richards. And if you have any questions, either for myself or Peter, now is the time to ask them.
Good day, everybody. I'll just have a very quick introduction before we take questions. One of the big challenges with a film like this that was shot in the Australian landscape, in Australian light, and with Australian insects and other things flying around is that when you come to do a restoration, it can be quite difficult to decide what are specks of dirt that are on the negative, what is little things that were in the environment at the time, because you want to be careful not to add anything to the original image that wasn't there. And that was why we decided to ship the ARRI scan over to Australia. The ARRI scan has an infrared module, and colour film is invisible to infrared. And what that does is that gives us a mask for every single frame of the film, which shows us what is actual dirt, what is actual scratches, and what is film damage, and what is not. And that allowed us to use that map when doing the restoration to ensure that we weren't painting out or digitally putting in anything that wasn't there originally. We spent, just in the Australian office, we spent over 1,000 hours and about 30 or 40 calls with Peter Weir and Russ going backwards and forwards to make sure that we captured the Australian light and the Australian look, which was one of Weir's big beefs with the previous releases, was that they looked more like Europe than like Australia. And in his words, he said that the Australian landscape could almost be considered the villain of the piece in this film. So it was important that it looked dry, that it had those red and orange overtones, and that it looked genuinely Australian. And at the end of the process, after much back and forth, Weir said that for the first time, we've finally captured the look of the Australian light to the effect that you could almost smell the gum leaves. And that really made my day. So if anyone has any questions, feel free to ask away.
Hi everybody, I'm Jerry from the Swedish Film Institute. Thank you for a very nice and interesting presentation. I just have a couple of questions. You mentioned that you, with this restoration, would end up with a 4K HDR and a film out eventually. If you have a really good 35 setup, which would be the preferred version to watch, do you think? The digital or the 35? And then my second question is, when I saw examples here of the previous color timing, which was about 10 years old or so, and I noticed a bit of a, let's say the sky looked a bit greenish partly. I've talked to other colleagues in the industry involved with restoration, and there seems to be a liking for tile and orange. Is it a fashion thing, how a film looks at a certain point when it's reissued, or is it usually connected with the creators? Thank you.
Peter, do you want to answer that?
It was the first question, whether it would be better to watch it off 35mm film or off the restored 4K HDR version. Was that the question? Peter Weir and I have actually gone extensively back and forth on this. Peter Weir's feeling was that he wasn't sure that putting it back out to 35mm, again, as a viewing experience, would necessarily add anything to the restored version of the film. Part of the things we discussed was that putting it back out to 35 does reintroduce the projector, any projector weave that might be there. It does give you a different light signature than watching it on a flat panel. But the conclusion that we both came to is that they're two different viewing experiences. So it really boils down to which look you prefer. The only way to do that would be to actually see both and to see what you prefer. Peter Weir didn't think there was any inherent advantage to it being back out on film again, other than for archival purposes, but he was very interested in actually having a look at the process and the print and deciding what his preferred version would be after we get the film out completed. Now, the second question, Daniel, could you paraphrase that one for me? I couldn't hear all of that.
Well, it was about whether there are fashions in the grading community as to what direction to go in at different particular times. Is that correct? Yes. I wouldn't say it was a fashion situation. It was more of an issue of doing what both Russell and Weir wanted. I mean, that's I wasn't thinking, and I can't speak for anything of 10 years ago. Let's say.
Yeah. I know that generally with releases and with remastered versions that you'll see films like Alien and other ones that suddenly get the teal and orange treatment when the things come out because that's a current fashion issue. But in this case, working with Russ and Peter, it was very important to them that they get the original look that they were trying to achieve with the colour palettes that they were trying to achieve at the day. The only areas where he strayed from his original vision was the few shots that they couldn't achieve the colour that they wanted at the time because they didn't have digital grading available to them. And that was where they come into the town at night time. And the feeling was at that era, the lighting in the streets and the houses would have been gas lighting. And so it would have been a much warmer light than they were able to produce on the film at the time. And so for those shots in the town, we did regrade those to Weir's direction to make those shots a bit warmer, as if the light was coming from gas lighting rather than electrical light. The rest of the film, however, was very much tied to the original prints, the original theatrical prints, and to their original notes and their original vision for colour. As Daniel said, it's kind of a period piece in the costume designs and the presentation of the film, and so they wanted to keep that alive. And it was very important that the costumes, as Daniel said, the whites that the girls are wearing are a huge array of different whites, yellows, off-whites, and they all look the same in previous versions, whereas in this version you can tell that the shirt that one girl is wearing is different to the colour of the collar and is different to the colour of the skirt that she has on. They're all variations of white. And the French teacher, her dress was purposely not bright white. It was slightly off-white. I won't go into the psychological reasons that they chose that, but those delineations were very important and they weren't there in previous home releases at least, but it's all there on the original print.
I must just add, speaking personally, my first experience of the film was seeing it on television in the UK, full frame, because of course it was shot open mount, then getting a video release, then getting the Criterion edition, which was 166 at the late 90s of the director's cut, and then getting the previous master. And the question is, I think that, how do you know the look of the film? I mean, the archival prints are a very, very useful guide, but they're still ultimately 50-year-old prints. And then on top of that, you have to deal with all the information on the negative scan. So I think that, I mean, it's really, it was invaluable to get the input of both Boyd and Weir on this project.
Yeah, and we certainly went back and forth with the colour multiple times, tweaking down to the skin tones, to the colour of the bush. One scene where one of the young men has been running and he's very sweaty. We said that in previous releases, because they'd made all the skin tones pale, you can see I'm Australian, I'm very pink. But the way he looked in that, he said he looks like he's got cholera rather than looking like he's just been running and he's hot and sweaty. And that were the things we're able to address. As I said, it was a very naturalistic grade, which is certainly easier to work to than a very stylistic grade that some other films might have.
Hi, thank you for all the insight and valuable information. I was actually wondering about the 35 film out. And since you mentioned that the color grade was started from scratch in view of making an HDR master, I was wondering how you will adapt that to 35 print, and if that grading will be new, if it will be compressed, if it will be going back to the reference of the prints of the era. I'm just wondering how you will make that transition. Thank you.
Well, that's the reason that the film out is not being screened here as we had originally hoped, because that's definitely a work in progress, and I'm sure Peter again can actually tell you the specifics of how we're approaching that.
Yeah, the way HDR grading works really is that you do your HDR grade and then you use that to create your SDR grade, and then you tweak the SDR grade to get the look that you want. When going back out to film, then it requires an SDR master. And we used the initial SDR grade that we did and that was approved by Peter and Russell as the reference for what we're going to be putting back out to film. Going back out to film adds the print grain as well, depending on the film stocks you cause. So there's a lot of technical issues with getting the film out to look the way we want it and to be comparable to an SDR version of the film. So effectively that grade for the film out will be yet another grade with the knowledge of how that grade will look once it's on film and once it's projected. And getting those two things to match is a science that is been mostly worked out, but it does take a lot of iterations backwards and forwards. And as Daniel said, one of the things once you go to a HDR grade of a 1970s film, especially a film like this where it has a very ethereal, soft look to it, HDR is almost the opposite of ethereal and soft looks in some way. You've got a higher dynamic range rather than a more compressed range that you'd get with that. So working to find ways to extend that color and that grade to make it look more natural and more realistic in HDR was certainly a big challenge, and that was where it was invaluable to be able to go back and forth with Peter many times to get the enhanced look and the more realism that HDR can offer without losing the ethereal qualities that sort of are the hallmark of the film. As Daniel said, Russell not only hung fabric around to diffuse the light, but he also went into a local department store and purchased, he told me he purchased wedding veil. And at the time in the 70s, a man was never seen in a store purchasing wedding veil. And he said he was more nervous about that than working on the film. He basically ran in, grabbed the first roll of wedding veil he could see, slammed the $50 down on the table and ran out of the store in a panic. But you know, times have changed a little bit. That was part of the look, was that soft look. And so again, capturing that on HDR and then making sure that's not lost again when we go back out to film is part of the challenge. But being able to work with the director and the DOP, let's just make sure we don't screw that up.
Hey there. I just wanted to ask about the multiple cuts and what goes to the play out to film, what gets screened theatrically, sort of where the original cut sits in terms of the release, like, because obviously Peter Weir has a preference. So I was curious what we'll be seeing here as in what was projected and what will be projected.
Okay, so just to recap, Weir is adamant that the director's cut is the definitive version. However, to restore it using the original camera negative, we went back to the theatrical cut, which is the negative. Now, for the actual festival play, for the film out, everything at Weir's insistence is the director's cut. I really had to push, and thanks to Peter's diplomacy, we were able to include both cuts on the home physical media release, with the theatrical cut having the original mono soundtrack, and then the director's cut having the more modern sound mix as well. So I think that for posterity, and I think that was the argument we used, it is important to recognize that there are multiple cuts, and there is interest in the evolution of the film, both as a viewing experience, but also in terms of production history. And for that reason too, we've also included 2K scans, which were carried out by the National Film and Sound Archive, not ourselves, of all the outtakes, because I don't know if you're aware, but there was actually, in the film, you have a voiceover at the end when Rachel Roberts, Mrs. Appleyard character, said she was found dead at the base of Hanging Rock, whereas in actually one of the outtakes, you do see her climbing the rock. And so it is interesting, I think, to see how the film evolved, not just during the editing, but also with very interesting and I think effective decision to remove that 10-minute section. It is a work in progress, and it does raise interesting questions. At what point does the film become closed? And I think this is an example of, it is an open text. And if you take that approach, you have to include all those elements, which is what we try to do as a project, and to have that framework as part of the physical media release.
Hi, thanks. I was wondering if you could just confirm the format of the original prints. Are they all Eastman, for example, or did you find variation there? And just on the sound work, was there anything to add on the what you've undertaken right now for the new master, or was it available just to lay back? Thanks.
Peter, you got it out the archive, so.
Yeah, would you be able to repeat the question? I couldn't hear that one clearly.
The film stocks used on the original prints in the archive, was it Eastman? Because it was shot on Eastman colour.
Yeah. Yes, it was Eastman. It was Eastman stock. The dupes were also Eastman. The titles and some of the effect shots were also on Eastman. And the negative was in pretty good shape. It has faded slightly. I'd say maybe about 5% fade, and it had some dirt and flecks, but you can actually see those on the original print, so they were embedded in the negative from the get-go. But yeah, I probably spent more time scanning this film than I've spent on anything. I think we scanned it a total of 6 times just to make sure that we got everything perfectly right. Every time there was a change of film stock, we readjusted the scanner. And the ARRI scan has the color science for those film stocks built into the scanner. So we actually tell the scanner what film stock is in there, and it works out the color science to make sure it does get every last drop of information out of the film. And so we spent just over 400 hours of scan time on the film to make sure that we really getting my hands on this on the original camera negative was like a life's dream come true. So we put in way more hours than we would normally do to make sure we got it all. And so was there a second part of that question about sound, or did I mishear?
The sound elements.
Yeah, the sound elements, we got the original optical audio, the NFSA transferred some magnetic audio, and we got the 5.1 mix that was redone, I think, in 97. And I spoke to Peter a lot about the actual sound on the film. And one of the things that he liked about the 5.1 mix was the addition of a subwoofer channel, because he had recorded and used a lot of sound elements that were meant to be subliminal. You're not meant to really hear them in the film, you're meant to feel them. To give that feeling of a dream, and to give that feeling of unease where you're not sure why you're uneasy, but you are. And so he recorded or used recordings of earthquake sounds, And they actually underlay a lot of the parts of the film when they're in the Australian bush, because he said he thought that the earthquake would give a visceral reaction to people of fear and unease, but he just wanted it pitched up enough so he didn't really notice it was there. And he combined that with some of the shots where he shot in slow motion, but got the actors to act at double speed so that it had a dreamlike quality where you could tell something wasn't quite right because it was in slow motion, even though people were moving at normal speed. And so the sound elements that we got for that, it was very important that we got them at the levels and got the mix right with exactly how Peter wanted it. And that was really his reference in the 90s. It was done very well. It required very little touching of that sound.
Just to add to that, and just on the subliminal subject, I mean, there's also really very subtle tricks like I think Michael, one of the characters, when he's looking for Irma, he's actually walking backwards, but it's flipped over, so it's got this very kind of unnerving effect. I mean, he still appears to be walking forward, but it's so, I mean, yeah, it's the sound is integral as part of all these subliminal effects and the slow motion as well.
Yeah, and Peter said they listened to the entire soundtrack of the film without watching the film multiple times because he wanted to know that the emotional graph of the film was taking you on the correct journey, even if the visuals weren't there. And so that was an interesting exercise. We actually sat down and just listened to the entire film in its entirety before revisiting the sound, and then watched the film without sound, and then watched the two of them together. And it's a completely different experience.
Is that it? Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'd just like to say thank you for Peter Richards for coming in at very, very short notice today. Thank you, Peter. Yeah.